Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Tatiana Kolovou, who is an award-winning teaching professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Tatiana has reached over 10 million learners in multiple courses through her online platform. In this captivating episode, we delve into the various aspects of interpersonal communication, ranging from mastering small talk to navigating impromptu conversations with strangers, to engaging with influential individuals and crafting compelling elevator pitches. Moreover, we discuss strategies to enhance virtual communication, providing you with practical insights and time-tested techniques to elevate your effectiveness in the digital realm. Enjoy. Welcome to the program, Tatiana.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Charles.
Love to move the conversation into tips for small talk and speaking to strangers. Everyone has issues with this. Introverts have probably more issues than extroverts with it, but what are some good practices to practice this? You know, whether you're waiting in a line at a coffee shop, in a grocery store, maybe at a concert or an event, how can you have these impromptu conversations with strangers and build more skill and hopefully have less anxiety when you do it?
I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. If they feel that this is something they want to work on, then let's build a training program around saying, let's have you practice in a common or in a comfortable environment. And then let's have you move on to a workplace environment. And then let's have you move on to a workplace environment with people that are at a higher level. So there's a definite scaffolding that you can take. I would say initially, the very first thing is to be attuned. If someone is not interested in engaging, they're not going to make eye contact. They're going to look at their phone. They're going to look away. But be alert. And this a lot of times happens when you travel, when you're in a new city, when you're in a coffee shop, of making eye contact and looking to see who you can just say a good morning to and being comfortable with doing that. COVID and being on virtual environments has ruined our ability to build rapport and create rapport, and doing and having those first connections. And small talk is important. So pay attention and then look around the setting. You may mention something about the weather. You may mention something about traffic, or and you don't want to say, hi, my name is. That's not the time to introduce yourself. That comes a little later. But first I tell people, get comfortable with just breaking the ice a little. And if the person backs away and doesn't connect, then okay, let it go. Another important part is recognizing repeated or rejected content. Rejected content is, I may say, do you come here often? No, this is my first time. Okay, so I'm not going to keep asking about where they travel and where else they've traveled. I may change the conversation and redirect. So I may come up with a different general and open question about a game that just happened, or about something that's in the context and in the environment. I encourage people to practice some of this, especially if they're going into new places. You never know who you're going to sit next to on a plane, be in an elevator with, or be washing your hands in the bathroom next to someone. There's great opportunities to connect, but you have to be brave enough to get started with them.
And you bring up some great points. I mean, make the context relevant, or the comments relative to the context. So if you're in a waiting room, if you're in a dentist's office, look for those opportunities. Everyone's looking for scripts. But like you said, stay open, stay receptive, make sure that they're willing to connect with you. Don't force the conversation. You can ask some open-ended questions. If you're at a conference, you know, the keynote speaker had so much energy today. What did you think from their book? Some indirect questions, you know, maybe even some direct questions, you know, what brings you to the conference?
Is this
Just
your
to give
first
them
time?
some, questions.
But you started by asking about famous people or interesting people. Have you seen the MasterCard commercial where there's a woman in an elevator and Mary J. Blige walks in and she's thinking in her head, I know all of your songs. I know when your birthday is. She's rambling. And then Mary J. Blige just nods to her and walks away. And she's like, oh, I missed that opportunity. Being on your toes and saying, love your latest album. That's all you need to say. What are they going to say? They're going to just, wave you off and walk away. All right, maybe if they're having a bad day, but have the courage. A lot of it has to do with courage. Have the courage to be on your toes and say something like that. It's a compliment. What is the famous person going to say? Good luck on your campaign. All right, if it's a politician or you see a famous actor, I'm a super fan, and just leave it to that. Just be tight, short, keep it tight. It's okay.
And it's a great way to microdose your bravery and practice these opportunities, especially
Yeah,
when they're with influential or famous people. Like you
yeah,
state, make your introduction memorable, do your homework, make the connection relevant, and then use the same tips that you would in other situations, but try to establish that connection and don't get too personal too quick.
oh my goodness, yeah, because especially with people that get a lot of attention from it, the last thing they want is for you, "Oh, can I have your autograph?" Or yeah, some of that gets a little tiresome for them, I'm sure. But again, you don't want to miss the opportunity to say hello
Be brief, be ready when you interact
and
with an influential
be
person.
gone.
Yeah, and be gone. And they're likely to
Be
have
gone.
limited time. So just realize
Yes,
that. And some are nicer than others, but I think with this approach, I think you have a better chance of having that connection and making a good impression on them.
for sure. For
How about
sure.
for small talk? I mean, so we've talked about strangers, kind of talked a little bit about influential people, but just becoming a better conversationalist, right? You're at a party, you're at a bar, you're at wherever, someone comes up to you. What's a good way or a good process to strike a conversation so that maybe let's talk about the beginning first,
Mhm.
and let's also talk about how to end it in the right
How
way.
to end
So
it. You started it by saying, what brings you here? What's the story? What's your story? Or what's your path? That's a wonderful example of an open-ended question that allows me to give you more data that then later you can add additional questions and open-ended ones for you. So think of what your openers are. You may say, what brings you here? So what's your story? So how many times have you visited? Whatever the context is, think of open-ended versus yes, no, and think of questions that you ask that allow the person to continue to speak and connect with you. That's the best part of the conversation that I would say. And then focus on them. The good conversationalist will flip it and get you then to around and may say at the end, now, what about you? Tell me about you. And you see sort of that back and forth playing out. Sadly, there's people, and I had a meeting with one of them the other day, that I was asking a lot of those open-ended questions. And at the end, I realized he didn't ask me one thing. And then I'm thinking, was it because of me peppering and tell me about your parents and how is this business going and how is that going? And then I thought, I didn't share anything. Is it my fault? Or is it that I didn't give the opportunity for that person to, I held the questioning floor. Maybe that's what I did. But good conversationalists receive and give, and it's more of a dance. And again, you may, as an introvert, want to go home and take a nap afterwards, but it also doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to do that when you're in that context, that social context.
you're right. I had a good piece of advice from another thought leader that said, if you want to be more interesting to others, be more interested in them, because everyone's favorite topic is themselves. I've
Yes.
had, like what you were just saying, Tatiana, I've had many conversations where they didn't ask me one question, and later I learned that they had a wonderful time with me, a great conversation. I'm thinking to myself, they didn't ask me one thing. I just kept on asking them about themselves, and they were very happy with giving more insight. I think too many people put that pressure on themselves. I need to be interesting. I need to be interesting. When in fact, you need to be interested in the other person and ask
Yeah.
them those kind of questions.
And when you do that and you have that information, you go back and say, that was so fascinating. You told me that story. Whatever happened? If you can remember, and even if you take some notes, that you can continue to build that rapport, you have the data. Think of that information as data. You remember kids' names. So I don't remember people's names as much. I have to really practice on that, but I'll remember if someone's daughter just got engaged and is getting married, and I'll say, how was the wedding? What happened? And they'll say, you remembered. Somehow I recover that information and it's impressive. But again, jot down some of those details so you can continue the conversation. For many of our friends who may be listening, They want to follow up in an email, or they may want to write a thank you card, and they bring some of that content back into the message. That makes it a lot more meaningful.
How about now you have this conversation, you're trying to have this small talk with this other person, and they just are giving you these one-word answers, and you feel like they're really not engaged in the conversation. What do you do now?
Sure. Maybe they need a break from you as well, and you need to exit stage left. And it's good to say, wonderful talking to you. I'm going to move over and chat with some more folks. Or you may say, I don't want to take up all of your time. Or you may say, I'm sure there's others that you'd like to meet as well. It's been great chatting with you. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. So be diplomatic, be pleasant, but you don't want to say, obviously, you don't want to talk to me. You never know what's going on in their lives and in their minds. But exiting a conversation, it's as much as you practice entering conversations, you need to practice exiting them as well. So you're not hopelessly sitting there waiting for someone to bail you out. In a conference setting where there's a lot of people coming and going, it's a little easier as well, but you may want to think about practicing those skills as well. This is hard to exit the conversation. Or if you and I were chatting, I would say, well, you've had such great questions for me. I've really appreciated talking to you. I don't want to take up too much of your time, about you again. And I may say, I've learned a lot from our conversation. So that may be kind of hinting into doing a wrap up.
Excellent.
Easier to be in a social setting to exit than in this setting to exit.
I've even found a good piece of advice when you're having a good conversation, but you're, say, in a conference or you have other people you want to talk to, is just saying, I'm going to ask you one more question, but then, I need to go over here and make note of this person, because it gets awkward if you don't do that. If you don't set it up prior to, if you just kind of say, well, I got to go to the bathroom, the restroom, which, is kind of a cop out, right? I mean, you want to make sure that they feel like you're not just pushing them off to someone that you really want to talk about. And that's a good strategy, just to say, I got one more question for you, then I really need to go and see so-and-so. So they feel like they are valued, and it's not just you're trying to exit awkwardly.
Or you're hinting that there's a closure coming, right?
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of saying an in conclusion, which I always hate to hear in presentations. It's better to say, I've shared a lot. Let me leave you with one thought. That's a better thing to say than in conclusion. You kind of wait for the drum roll to come out to announce your closure. So somehow, as you said, I have one more question for you. If there's one more thing I want to ask, is this. So you can decide that. Very good.
There's some great tips on this. Those steps are: introduce yourself, break the ice with a context comment or two, then introduce a topic with more depth, ask a question about it, get them to talk about themselves.
Yeah.
Introduce new topics when one is worn out. Listen verbally and non-verbally. We can do that through Zoom. We can definitely do that in person. And I think that's just a underutilized part of the communication strategy.
Absolutely.
One of my thought leaders in another interview, she's a body language expert, and she stated, do you know what, Charles, is the most honest part of your body? And I was like, I have no idea. She's like, the farthest body part from your brain, your feet. You can tell a lot about how engaged they are with the conversation by where their feet are pointing, or who the leader is in a group. So great insights if you just pay attention, right? It just takes your deliberate attention to focus on some of those.
Very true.
For elevator pitches, I just wanted to touch briefly on this, because I see this a lot when you have so this is kind of part of small talk, right? You're in an elevator. I mean, we can just use the literal example. You have 30 to 45 seconds. Someone asks you, who are you and what do you do? A lot of time people fumble over this. They get long-winded. They get awkward. They say things that are not even relevant. When in reality, you should have something prepared, a pitch that you've practiced and that it's almost memorized. I mean, this is one case where a memorized script is really beneficial.
If someone says usually is, tell me a little bit more about you. It depends. If you're in a social setting, you may talk about your upbringing or what brings you here. If you're in a professional setting and you want the person to remember you as what it is that you do. So if I say to you, Charles, tell me a little bit about your company. I'm sure you've got a one-liner, we help leaders succeed through learning, or something like that in that sentence that you have And you need to be able to spin it in many different ways. Quite often we help our academics think about, tell me about your research. Boom, you've got to be able to hit this. Tell me a little bit about your background. Again, you have that. Tell me a little bit about what you do. You need to make a list of all of those questions. Maybe you and I don't have those as much, or maybe it's at different times of our lives that we need to practice those. But for being in the workplace or being in the office place, when someone may stop you and say, tell me about that presentation, you better have your headline that you can share, and then 2 to 3 things about that. So for example, we're looking to do this, this, and this. So at the end of the day, if we have succeeded, you will see this. So you can have 30 seconds that you share that compiles back to saying you should be able to use your idea or your theme in 6 words. You should be able to communicate that. But it's not
Yep.
going to happen by osmosis.
Right. Absolutely. And you have 2 dimensions that you say to really stress upon, and that's practice your warmth and practice your competence.
So true. And this goes even back to the beginning of our conversation about communication. And one may communicate warmth as likability or friendliness or connection. That warmth, for leaders especially, is where we judge people the most. Do I want to speak to them, follow them, connect with them? Do I want to spend a little bit more time? Do they give positive vibes versus they seem a little bit cold or closed or reserved? And the other piece is, are they capable? Are they credible? Are they trustworthy? That takes a little bit more. You assume that someone in a higher position is going to have all those credentials. But again, that likability and that power or that credibility depends on the situation. You'll quite often see CEOs that are apologizing about a mistake a company has made. They really need to pump up warmth, because the sincerity that they communicate with has to come across. If they're communicating an urgent situation that has to happen or has happened, they've got to build up competence. So those 2 depend on the situation as well.
And sometimes it's difficult to have that warmth piece, right? To really kind of understand it. So verbal warmth, you mentioned, visual language, use stories, which we'll get into here in just a few minutes, use some vivid details, conversational language, and then, the warmth with the nonverbals, maybe a little bit easier, smile, do things that are just warming, palms up versus palms down.
Or hand to chest. You see people that say, I'm really sorry. I am very sorry. That hand to chest gesture is the most genuine one that you can use. Facial expressions. Watch yourself on a video. If you look like you're playing poker and people can't read if you're happy about something, upset about something, maybe at times, again, who knows how much influence legal departments have on what leaders of organizations can show or not show. But you asked about warmth, and a lot of it comes from the mirror of our soul, in a way, our eyes and our facial expressions, and how much we lean in or sit back or pause or look away. All those nonverbals will communicate likability and trust and connection that we have. And the smile, or a little bit of a smile, comes together with that as well.
Absolutely. Leave the poker face at the poker table. Show that warmth and that connection and that emotion, because like you said, it really brings trust, it brings connection, authenticity, and that's what you want if you're a leader. And the other thing that really helps with small talk that I found helps with all aspects of communication, but having stories and being able to tell certain stories really connects you with your audience much better, gets better remembered, and it's just more effective in engaging an audience. A story well told is really a powerful tool that more leaders should be using.
Yes, but they need a story notebook. You can't just make these things up. You read something, you write it down. You hear something in a podcast, and maybe don't think of story. Think of examples, vivid examples. You don't have to, once upon a time, you may say, let me give you an example, or let me tell you what happened just the other day. That's a story, but you are describing it in a shorter example. think and write and make note of things that happen. And then you can get good enough at saying, I'm going to use this as an example of customer service. We're getting into the summer months and we all have experiences traveling and being tourists in a way, and things that they may happen. Just to give you an example, I was with my students. We had just landed into Greece, and I had told them how important creating a relationship first is. And we were walking on a boardwalk, and I was looking for a sea urchin, because I always kind of start our trip with something that's unique and different, to give the analogy of how many things they're going to see that are weird at first and eventually they will become familiar with. And as I'm looking for the sea urchin, we passed by a grandpa and his little boy, and the little boy's hat, it was windy, fell off into the water. And one of our students grabbed it and gave it back to them. And he was so thankful. Next thing you know, the grandpa is climbing rocks to find the sea urchins for us, because he learned that this is what we wanted to do. And the student said, you told us that this happens in Greece, but we just saw it an hour after getting off the airplane. I couldn't have planned this any better. And it's a great story to tell, is to say they communicated nonverbally by picking up the little boy's hat out of the water, giving it back to him. The grandpa was going to help us on our quest to find the sea urchins. And it was a really great, I couldn't have planned it, but it was a good example of how that happened. I'll continue to use that.
You're right. So to put less pressure, it's not this elaborate story. Use examples, illustrate something. Someone once told me, you don't retell a story, you relive a story. So it has to be something from a personal experience that you really have felt deeply, because then you have more authenticity in telling it. And you need to tell it multiple times, evoke emotions, the senses, get people in that scene with you, versus just trying to say it at a very high level, which is not very effective.
Or it could be a good story of someone else, and you're telling it as, listen to this. This is how these two people met. I remember a story that I tell about one of the owners of the bus company that drives our bus. How he met his wife. So he told the story, incredible storytelling, but I've told it again to others, again, not in a business setting and environment, but you could tell a story that you've heard about, or something you heard on a podcast, if it speaks to you about someone else. Again, I agree, the level of emotion won't be at that level, but it could be a good depiction of a comment, of a point that you make.
And you're right. Many of them come from your own experience, but you can read and hear great stories as well. That helps to illustrate your ideas. It's just like you said initially, have a notebook. You got to be more deliberate. You got to jot them down, because they're not going to come to mind when you need them if you haven't been deliberate in your approach prior to that.
And then you'll forget them. Yeah, have your story example notebook and keep it close by. Or you can even leave it on the notes of your phone, but don't forget to write things down.
Wonderful. Well, the final topic I wanted to cover before we end our conversation today is around communicating in a virtual or digital space. Many people ask me this: how is it different, Charles? What should I be doing or noting that I would note maybe in person? Perhaps you can give us some ideas, some advice, some insights into how we can better or more effectively communicate in this virtual world.
Part of it has to do with your energy and what you're bringing to the meeting or to the communication, and how you're setting things up, because you can communicate warmth and competence in this way too. And a lot of it has to do with preparation. For you and I, we jumped through some hoops to try to figure out sort of the best platform and the best timing. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Depending on how much of that is connected. But assuming that the virtual setting is the best channel, because sometimes it's not. We talked about writing or phoning or just having an audio meeting. Assuming that virtual is the best channel, you want to be well planned, especially if it involves a lot of people, because the last thing you want is someone to have a bad experience in your meeting. It went on forever. We were talking in circles. And then you have a challenge of losing trust, and people do not want to be at your meetings again. So if you are planning to work in a group of people in a working setting, be very diligent about how much time you spend into planning your meeting. If it's a one-on-one where you are, it's okay to say, these are the 3 things that we could discuss, just like you did with me, Charles. You send me an agenda so I could be thinking ahead. And obviously, you want to bring the energy. Quite often I stand for meetings. I want to make sure I have a lot of light. I want to make sure the sound is good and everything is set up in a place where it's not distracting to you. We talked a little bit about being able to see yourself or not see yourself, and then choosing the best place as far as the channel that you're going to use. Quite often I use an app called where you see the slides on my right versus me going away and the slide being dominant if I'm doing a presentation. And I'll probably use that for our IMS workshop. But I do think you are the focus. If you are doing a presentation, you need to be the focus. Your slides are not the focus. That's another topic.
We've seen this a lot. We run so many of these programs, and I'm sure you agree with this, is engagement is so much tougher virtually. So like you said, you have to bring the energy. You have to find ways to keep your audience engaged. During our programs, we mentioned have that video on. You're less likely to do 5 different things in the background if the video is on. We're engaging them throughout the program, making sure they're paying attention. But it's so much more difficult. I would say it's more difficult each and every year we go through this, because initially Zoom was somewhat of a novelty for most people and it was kind of fun and exciting. Now it's like, not another Zoom meeting. I have Zoom
Yeah.
fatigue. I just want it to end.
But if it's a big group and people don't have their cameras on, I understand it. There are other things going on, but you may say, okay, take 2 minutes, write down in the chat the first thing that comes in mind in doing this, or I have a Slido going on, go ahead and vote, or what do you think about this or this? The first A through K, write on the chat, the first word that comes to mind, L through Z, open your mics and comment on what you just heard. You have to, as the facilitator, as the meeting leader, with the bigger groups, you really have to have a game plan, because if you don't, it's just another meeting and it creates meeting fatigue and you lose credibility as the meeting organizer.
And it's a balance that you have to have as well, because if we have our video on, you can read nonverbals as well as the verbal. So you're getting more information about how your message is coming across, but at the same time, it could be exhausting the other person, and really they just want to focus on maybe just having their video off, and you just have to get the auditory pieces of it, even though it's not the complete picture for that communication.
Yeah. If it's a one-on-one or a small group meeting, it's, to me, you have to have cameras on. It would be similar as meeting at a conference and I say, well, hi, nice to meet you. And then I turn my back to you and continue talking to you. That's what cameras off is. If you're in a small group, it should be understood.
Absolutely. Any other tips to help them deal with those virtual meetings or in the virtual space?
Yeah.
Is there better platforms that you prefer over others? I know that we use Zoom because it's so intuitive, but
yeah. I always say I'm not doing it now. I prefer to stand when I deliver. I tend to have more energy. I prefer to keep tighter virtually, keep tighter timelines versus in-person trainings when it comes to trainings or presentations. I would prefer for people to be able to, in virtual meetings, give moments for people to think and write, and if they're going to use the chat, allow for that to happen. To give you an example, coming up next, I have 100 people in an organization, and they were asking me yesterday, how do you prefer to use the chat? Honestly, as a speaker, for me, it's distracting because I'm trying to accommodate that and trying to deliver a message. And I said, would you mind if I just jump off of the visuals and go into the fishbowl and then look at what the chat, so I can connect with people and make sure that their questions are answered. But again, you have to have a good strategy with that. This entire time, I've been staring at my camera. I don't really look at your face much when you're here. I've had to do that and get used to doing more of that, because that image in a one-on-one, that's challenging if you don't practice that specifically.
I've even done it when I first started, had a little sticky by the camera.
Arrow.
Right? Arrow, smiley face, just to draw your attention to the camera, because you have that tendency to want to see the people, and then you start looking down or
like,
looking to the side.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're not connecting. But in live in person, not an issue, but virtually that becomes an issue because of just the medium. So
Absolutely.
So before we end, what would be the first thing leaders could do to become more effective communicators?
Receive feedback and They can receive feedback now anonymously. There are many AI tools where they can jump in and say, answer the question, tell me a little bit more about you. So they can get feedback on tone, on speed, on energy, on emotion, and then go back and try to lather, rinse, and repeat. It's very nerve-wracking to communicate on camera, but the only way you know is if you're doing something well, is just like athletes do when they train for important sports. To them, they record themselves, they sit down with a coach, they look at it, they go back and they try it again. If you don't course correct, you will always do what you were doing before, and that's fine if that works for you. But if you want to grow and learn and be an lifelong learner, as we said when we started, you really need feedback from people, from experts, feedback from AI tools a little bit that we have now, and continuously try to improve on that. So if you want to, I challenge my students quite a lot, and I say, end of the year, let's have you do a TED Talk. We'll just do it here, invite your friends, and you're working towards 7 to 12 minutes of a topic of your choice. And they look at me and they freeze. And I think, didn't you say you wanted to improve on your communication? Take the challenge. And they always get startled, but the ones that take it improve if it's presentations they want to be better at, say.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for joining me today on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
They can follow me on LinkedIn. I have several different courses on LinkedIn Learning that I have been able to produce in many different languages with lots of learners, and they can watch some of those there. I have a newsletter called Stronger that comes out once per month, and it always shares ideas and strategies on how to level up communication and how to be a better communicator in general. So I hope that's helpful.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.